The first thing people asked that morning was a question the palace hoped no one would ever dare utter aloud. Why now? Why just days before Christmas? Why choose the moment when the world expects warmth, family, forgiveness, and unity to deliver the harshest royal punishment in modern history? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Because sometimes a crown doesn't wait for holidays. Sometimes consequences don't pause for festive lights. Sometimes a king decides enough is enough. Before sunrise, while most of Britain still slept under the calm December sky, something happened inside Windsor Castle that shattered the illusion that things were fine between King Charles and the Sussexes. A messenger, quiet, unremarkable, almost ghost-like, slipped through the side entrance carrying a single white envelope stamped with a crimson seal. An envelope that, in the right hands, could erase a royal life's identity in one stroke. Have you ever felt tension in the air before anyone says a word? That's what the palace staff described. A pressure, a silence, a heaviness, as if the walls themselves were holding onto a secret too enormous to speak. Inside that envelope was something that had been drafted, argued about, debated, revised, and redrafted countless times over the past 2 years. The letter of patent that would revoke the Sussex title. Revoked, not paused, not suspended, not voluntarily relinquished. Revoked by the monarch himself. And what made that even more shocking? It wasn't the act alone. It was the timing. Right before Christmas. Right as divorce proceedings quietly finished behind closed doors. Why combine these two moments? Why orchestrate a move this public on a week this symbolic? Something had happened. Something that pushed this decision out of the realm of political formality and into the territory of personal breaking point. What would make a father choose this week, of all weeks, to formally sever the last symbolic tie between his son and the institution he will one day leave behind? The palace won't say it directly, but insiders know the truth. Something snapped. But before we get there, before we reach the revelation that turned a simmering royal feud into a full-blown, legally stamped royal separation, we need to step back into that room at Windsor where King Charles paced slowly, envelope in hand, knowing the decision he made tonight would echo for generations. Imagine the weight of that. Imagine staring at a document that could rewrite history. Imagine knowing the world would react within seconds. But imagine something even harder, knowing that if you didn't sign it, someone else would pay the price. Because the truth, the real truth behind this moment, isn't just about titles. It's about betrayal, legacy, fear, and a marriage that reached its breaking point long before the public ever sensed a thing. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's pull back and place you in that moment. The moment a king looked at the same signature line his mother once used to legitimize the Sussex title and felt the weight of undoing it. The clock ticked. The December cold seeped through the window panes. And somewhere across the Atlantic Ocean, Harry and Meghan had no idea that tonight, this night, would end the royal chapter they once fought so hard to keep. But the real question is, why tonight? Why Christmas? Why a letter of patent? The most formal, most irreversible method the monarchy possesses. Well, that part is buried beneath months of secrets. Conversations the public was never meant to hear. Moves made behind the scenes. Advisors warning the king that something was coming, something big, and that the monarchy needed to act before being blindsided. Have you ever watched someone smile in public while their private life collapses behind them? That's exactly what happened with Harry and Meghan these past few months. Public silence. Private chaos. A marriage that tabloids assumed was merely strained, but insiders knew was structurally cracked. And King Charles watched all of it. Not as the monarch, but as a father. A father who realized that what was coming next, the finalization of divorce proceedings, would detonate through the royal family unless he controlled the narrative. So how do you get ahead of a story that will dominate every headline for weeks? You take control of the first headline. And that headline was simple. King Charles revokes Sussex title. But that headline doesn't tell the whole story. It doesn't tell you the phone call that happened 48 hours earlier. It doesn't tell you the explosive revelation from a senior aide. It doesn't tell you why Meghan's lawyers escalated the divorce timeline. It doesn't tell you why Harry stopped taking certain calls. It doesn't tell you why William, who had remained mostly silent publicly, urged the king to act without delay. And most importantly, It doesn't tell you what Charles discovered the week before Christmas that made the title revocation go from a matter of consideration to a matter of urgency. But we're getting closer. Because as the king held that envelope, as he stood alone in his study illuminated only by a single lamp, he didn't see Harry the way the public sees him. He didn't see the prince who walked behind Diana's coffin. He didn't see the young man who gave passionate speeches for veterans. He didn't see the teenager who used to sneak into the kitchens at Kensington Palace for leftover sticky toffee pudding. The man standing in that study saw his son as someone caught in a storm he could no longer protect him from. And that's where the emotional fracture begins. Not with betrayal, not with anger, but with heartbreak. Because this decision, revoking the Sussex title, wasn't a punishment. It was a shield for the monarchy, a shield for the public image of the crown, a shield for the legacy of the institution King Charles had spent decades preparing to inherit. But also, a shield for Harry himself, whether he knew it or not. Because the divorce, the quiet, almost secretive divorce proceedings, created a legal chain reaction that would force the monarchy into a difficult position unless something changed fast. Think of it like chess. 2 players, multiple strategies. But in the end, only one move determines the outcome. And revoking the Sussex title, that was the move the king realized he would be forced to make whether he wanted to or not. Do you feel that tightening sensation in your chest? That slow realization that something much bigger is unfolding? Good. Because that's exactly how the palace felt in the days leading up to this morning. Everything accelerated. Everything sharpened. Everything darkened. And now, we're finally stepping into the truth. The real truth. Behind the timing, the secrecy, and the emotional shockwaves that would blast through the royal family like a winter storm. Because the moment King Charles broke the wax seal on that envelope, everything changed. And what came after that? Well, that part is where the story truly begins. And nothing, absolutely nothing, will prepare you for what triggered his final decision. As King Charles unfolded the document, the room seemed to tighten around him. The air grew still. Even the faint hum of the heating vents sounded louder, like the castle itself was holding its breath. This was no ordinary piece of royal paperwork. This wasn't a ceremonial letter welcoming a new ambassador or extending holiday goodwill to the Commonwealth. This was the undoing of a royal identity. And Charles knew something most people didn't. Titles aren't just ornaments. They're shields. They're weapons. They're responsibilities. They're symbols that outlive the people who hold them. Taking one away is the closest thing a monarch has to reversing time itself. But what pushed him to do it now? Not 2 months ago. Not during the coronation fallout. Not after the Netflix series. Not after Spare. Why now? Right before Christmas. That's the part the world hasn't heard yet. Not the real part. Not the devastating part. Not the part that forced the king's hand in a way no royal drama ever has. The palace calls it an accelerated necessity. Insiders whisper a very different word. Crisis. And the truth behind that crisis began long before the envelope arrived, long before divorce papers were drafted, long before arguments reached American media or British tabloids. It began with something small, something almost invisible, a crack so thin you'd miss it unless you were standing close enough to feel the tension. But over the past year, that crack widened. Slowly, quietly, then violently. And King Charles watched it unfold like a father watching a marriage he helped bless fall apart piece by piece. Do you know what's strange about royal divorces? The public always hears about the ending, but they rarely hear about the beginning. The real beginning. The quiet moments where 2 people stop talking, stop understanding, stop fighting for the same future. Harry and Meghan didn't explode overnight. They eroded. One disagreement at a time. One silence at a time. One media battle at a time. And beneath that erosion was something darker, something that terrified the palace because if it went public in the wrong way, it wouldn't just embarrass the monarchy, it could destabilize it. That was the real fear. Not gossip, not headlines. Legacy. Monarchies don't fear scandal. They fear damage. And damage was coming. Fast. The first warning sign for Charles arrived 3 weeks before Christmas, when a senior palace aide brought him a report he didn't expect. It wasn't about finances. It wasn't about public appearances. It wasn't even about media strategy. It was about the one thing the monarchy cannot afford: loss of control. The report detailed conversations, private, sensitive, deeply personal conversations that revealed Harry and Meghan were no longer aligned. Not emotionally, not financially, not legally. Their marriage wasn't just strained, it was structurally failing. And when a royal marriage fails, the consequences are never small. We've seen it before. Diana and Charles, Andrew and Sarah, and in Mark. But never in modern history has a royal divorce collided with global media, Hollywood contracts, transatlantic branding, multiple lawsuits, political influence, and tens of millions of dollars on the line. This wasn't a marriage ending. It was a corporation collapsing. And if the corporation collapsed publicly, the monarchy would be forced to answer for it. That's why the king acted. That's why the envelope mattered. That's why this Christmas became the battlefield for one of the most unprecedented royal decisions of the century. But the report alone didn't push Charles into action. It was what followed. A phone call. Late. Unexpected. Emotional. The kind of phone call that changes a father's heartbeat. Not from Harry. Not from Meghan. Not from William. From someone the public never imagined would intervene. And what they told the king wasn't just shocking, it was dangerous. Dangerous enough that Charles knew that if he didn't act before Christmas, he might lose the ability to act at all. Have you ever felt a decision approaching before it arrives? That electric sensation before a storm hits? That's exactly what filled Buckingham Palace once the phone call ended. Staff moved faster. Advisors met behind closed doors. Legal teams reviewed old files. Public relations officers drafted statements just in case. Everyone knew something was about to happen. No one knew when, until that envelope arrived. Let's go back to that room for a moment. The lamp casting long shadows across the king's desk. The cold December air prickling through the curtains. The quiet ticking of a clock that somehow felt louder than usual. Charles stared at the letter of patent. The words were formal, cold, precise. Language designed to terminate a title that had once symbolized hope, modernity, and unity. The marriage that was supposed to bring the royal family into a new era. Instead, that era ended with a legal strike of ink. But there was something else, something no one outside his inner circle knew until now. The document he held wasn't the first draft. It was the seventh. 7 versions debated across 7 months. 7 iterations softened, then sharpened, then softened again. 7 moments where Charles convinced himself to wait, to hope things would change. But they didn't. They got worse. Because Harry and Meghan's marriage wasn't just ending. It was ending in a way that made the monarchy vulnerable. And when you're king, vulnerability is unacceptable. He lifted his pen. Imagine that moment. Imagine knowing the signature you're about to write will not just change your son's life. It will change how history remembers him. Hands steady, heart heavy, mind racing. And then, the signature. A single stroke of ink. The royal equivalent of a door closing. But here's the part almost no one knows. The moment Charles signed that document, he wasn't thinking about Harry. He was thinking about the monarchy. About the institution he waited 70 years to inherit. About the legacy he must protect. About the crown that must survive long after him. Because for the past 6 months, advisors warned him of something terrifying. If the Sussex divorce exploded publicly before the monarchy acted, public opinion could shift in ways the palace could not control. So Charles struck first, and that's why timing mattered. Christmas is the one moment the monarchy stands at its most visible, most emotional, most symbolic. The one moment the world looks directly at the Windsors. The one moment unity becomes a performance as much as a practice. Revoking the title before Christmas wasn't a cruelty. It was strategy. Cut the thread before it snaps on its own. Control the message before the message controls you. Rewrite the story before the story rewrites the monarchy. But here's the twist. What Charles didn't know, not yet, was that a second shock was coming. A shock buried inside the divorce proceedings. A shock that would reach his desk just hours after signing. And when he read it, the king realized that revoking the Sussex title wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Because the next revelation, the one tied to the divorce, was so explosive, so destabilizing, so emotionally devastating, that it would change everything the palace believed about the marriage. And that revelation? That's where chapter 1 begins. When dawn finally broke over Windsor, the castle looked peaceful from the outside. Golden light glowed across frosted lawns. Footmen shuffled quietly along the corridors. The kitchen staff began preparing breakfast trays. unaware that history had changed while they slept. But inside the king's study, peace was nowhere to be found. Because soon, very soon, someone else would learn what had happened. Harry. In that moment, that reaction, the first stunned silence on the other end of the phone, would haunt Charles long after the ink dried. But before that call, before the shockwaves reached Montecito, before the headlines erupted, one more document appeared on the king's desk, delivered by a senior royal advisor wearing the expression of someone carrying a secret far heavier than paper. A document from the Sussex divorce attorneys. And what that document contained, that was the real earthquake. It wasn't about property. It wasn't about custody. It wasn't about assets, media rights, or shared ventures. It was about something the palace never wanted the public to see, or even suspect. It was about the internal contradictions within the Sussex marriage. Contradictions that, if revealed, would turn the monarchy into collateral damage. Contradictions that could shift global sympathy. Contradictions that could destroy the carefully curated image of unity and purpose the couple once projected. And at the center of those contradictions stood one person, Harry, broken, conflicted, and more isolated than anyone imagined. Have you ever felt a moment coming, like the wind changes before a storm? That was the feeling that swept through the palace as the king opened the second envelope. The advisors who delivered it stood stone still, waiting for his reaction. They knew what was inside. They had read the summaries. Charles had not. The room fell silent again. He read the first page. His face tightened. He read the second page. His breathing changed. He reached the final page and set it down slowly, as if his hands suddenly weighed twice as much. Because now he understood the full picture. Now he knew why Meghan's legal team had accelerated the divorce timeline. Now he knew why Harry had grown increasingly withdrawn. Now he knew why certain decisions had been made. Decisions that contradicted private promises and public narratives. And, perhaps most painfully, he understood why the revocation of the Sussex title wasn't just appropriate. It was necessary. This wasn't about punishing a son. This was about protecting a monarchy from a marriage that had become a destabilizing force. A monarchy that had survived abdications, affairs, scandals, tragedies, and wars, but was now threatened by something far more personal. A broken partnership with global influence, divided loyalties, and legal implications stretching across 2 continents. But let's pause here, because before we reach the explosive detail inside that divorce file, the detail that would change everything the palace believed about the couple, we need to talk about the most important force behind this entire crisis. Time. Time is ruthless. Time is precise. Time doesn't care about traditions, or holidays, or appearances. And in the weeks leading up to Christmas, time was running out. Advisors warned that if the monarchy didn't move before the holidays, they would lose control of the narrative for the entire new year. That once the divorce went public, public sympathy, media framing, and global narratives would shift instantly, and not in the monarchy's favor. Harry wasn't just a son anymore. He was a symbol, a brand, a movement, a global figure with millions of supporters. If the divorce became the first headline, the monarchy would look weak, reactive, defensive, like a cornered institution trying to salvage dignity after a personal catastrophe. But if the title revocation came first, the monarchy looked decisive, strong, strategic, in control, and that was the only position King Charles could afford. So he made the hardest decision a monarch can make. He acted not as a father, but as a king. But something else pushed him too. Something deeper, more emotional, more private. A fear, not for the monarchy, not for reputation, for Harry. Because if the details inside that divorce file leaked, and they always leak, Harry's name would be dragged into a storm so intense that even Meghan's media network couldn't shield him. And Charles couldn't let that happen. He had already watched one woman he loved be devoured by public pressure. He would not watch his son experience the same fate. Not again. Not twice in one lifetime. This is the part people rarely acknowledge about Charles. Behind the crown, behind the protocol, behind the royal posture, is a man who has endured more emotional agony than most families face in a century. And watching Harry unravel, slowly, painfully, publicly, tore at him in a way few will ever understand. So when the divorce file hit his desk, and he read the lines that revealed just how fragile Harry had become, something changed inside him. This wasn't anger. This was protection. The revocation of the Sussex title wasn't revenge. It wasn't punishment. It was a shield. A shield Harry didn't even know he needed. Have you ever protected someone even when they were too hurt or too proud to accept help? That is exactly the position Charles found himself in. And he hated it. Because every decision he made in this crisis, every meeting, every warning, every silence, every signature, pulled him further away from being Harry's father and deeper into being Harry's king. And kings cannot act with emotion. Not openly, not visibly, but the emotion was there. He felt it in every word of that legal file. He felt it in Harry's recorded testimonies. He felt it in the contradictions between public affection and private disconnection. He felt it in the escalation of events over the past year. And when he set the papers aside, two truths became clear. Harry's marriage was over, and the monarchy had to act before the consequences spiraled out of control. That is the moment Charles picked up the phone. Not to call Meghan, not to call lawyers, not to call advisors, to call someone else. Someone who would later become the single most important voice in this crisis. And what they told him, their words, their warning, their desperation, would push him from hesitation into action. But we'll get to that, because now we return to the moment that changed everything. The king had signed the letter of patent. The royal seal was pressed. The document was ready for transmission. The Sussex title was officially revoked. And in that moment, the king thought the hardest part was behind him. He was wrong, because the next step, the next moment, the next revelation, was the one that would tear open the truth behind the Sussex marriage. And it's that truth, the real truth. The first sign something was wrong came long before the public caught even a whisper of trouble. It came in the form of a simple, almost unremarkable white envelope, placed quietly, almost too quietly, on a polished oak table outside King Charles's private study at 5:42 a.m. No announcement, no fanfare, no ceremonial handover, just an envelope. Isn't it strange how sometimes the smallest things carry the heaviest consequences? A single letter can end a career. A single message can end a friendship. A single document can rewrite a life. And that envelope? It carried all three. The palace messenger who delivered it didn't know its contents. He wasn't supposed to. His job was simple: deliver, bow, leave. But he felt something. A kind of tension. A kind of weight he couldn't explain. Palace veterans recognized it instantly. A storm was coming. And storms in the royal family never stay private for long. Have you ever walked into a room and felt like someone had just had an argument, even though no one said a word? That heavy, unspoken pressure? That's exactly what washed over the corridor as the envelope changed hands. Senior staffers exchanged glances. Advisors looked suddenly pale. Even the security detail straightened, as if bracing for impact. Because they knew something the outside world didn't. This wasn't the first envelope. This was the final one. Inside it was a printed notice from the king's private legal team. A summary of sealed documents sent from the Sussex's attorneys in California. Documents that confirmed something the palace had feared, speculated, and worried about for months. The divorce proceedings were complete. Not rumored, not alleged, not in negotiation. Completed, signed, sealed, and on their way to being filed in court the moment the Sussexes authorized public release. Imagine receiving that news as a monarch. Fatherhood and duty colliding at full speed. One emotion pulling you toward compassion, the other forcing you into action. That envelope contained the truth the public wasn't supposed to learn until January, after the holidays, when the monarchy could manage the fallout. But the Sussex team accelerated everything. Quietly, strategically, deliberately. And so here it was, on the king's desk, days before Christmas. a royal divorce, and a royal title still attached to a union that no longer existed. You might be asking yourself, why was the divorce kept secret for so long? Why didn't the press know? Why didn't the leaks start early, like they usually do? Simple. Because this time, both sides had something to lose. Meghan had her image. Harry had his reputation. The monarchy had its stability. Free fronts, free risks, free reasons to stay silent. But silence doesn't last forever, especially not when the truth carries political, legal, and emotional consequences that could ignite international scrutiny. And that's why the envelope wasn't just paperwork. It was a trigger. Because the moment Charles saw the words, "divorce concluded," he understood the nightmare scenario. Within days, tabloids around the world would blast out headlines tying the monarchy to a failed high-profile marriage. And what would appear right next to those headlines, over and over again? The title, the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. That title didn't belong to a divorced couple. Not in tradition, not in optics, not in legacy, and certainly not in a monarchy already fighting to maintain relevance. But the mess didn't end with the divorce being finalized. Inside the same envelope was something even more dangerous. A confidential memorandum summarizing the causes cited within the Sussex legal negotiations. Causes that contradicted everything the public believed about their relationship. Causes that included emotional disparities, financial misalignments, contractual disputes, living arrangements, and, most concerning of all, allegations of misrepresentation tied to the use of the royal title. This was not a simple split. It was a political, financial, and reputational minefield. And the very title Charles had granted years earlier was now being used as a bargaining point in a legal dissolution. For any other family, that would be unfortunate. For the royal family, it was unacceptable. Because the monarchy cannot be a tool. It cannot be a bargaining chip. It cannot be leveraged in negotiations. And in that moment, Charles realized the obvious. If he waited even one more week, he would lose control of the narrative. But let's return to the corridor that morning. A corridor that felt more like the eye of a hurricane. As the envelope began circulating between senior advisors, whispers started. Is this real? Already? How far along are they? Does Harry know the king knows? Does the media know? And beneath those whispers, a question none dared say out loud. What happens to the title? Royal protocol says titles granted at marriage remain unless revoked by the sovereign or renounced by the holder. But historically, renunciations come after scandal, not divorce. Revocations come after misconduct, not emotional drift. This situation? It didn't fit any precedent. And to make matters worse, another envelope arrived only 40 minutes later. This one bearing the royal seal. The official summary of the letter of patent. Drafted, reviewed, prepared for signature, waiting for one final decision. Imagine the pressure building in that room. Imagine carrying the weight of 1,000 years of monarchy on your shoulders. Imagine trying to separate your role as father from your role as sovereign while the clock ticks toward Christmas. Every advisor said the same thing. Act now, or the monarchy looks reactive rather than commanding. Act now, or risk appearing blindsided. Act now, or allow the Sussex divorce to define the royal narrative for the next 6 months. Act now. And still, Charles hesitated, because every path forward cut someone he loved. Harry, the grandchildren, even Meghan, who, despite everything, had once been welcomed with celebration and hope. That's the tragedy of monarchy. Every victory brings a shadow. Every decision has a cost. But hesitation couldn't last, because something else happened that morning. Something small, almost accidental, that pushed the king toward a decision he'd been avoiding. A staff member, unaware of the tension, casually mentioned something in passing. Sir, the Christmas cards will be ready for approval soon. The family grouping is the same as last year unless you'd like to adjust. That one sentence, that innocent reference to a family grouping, hit Charles like an emotional punch to the chest. Because for the first time since the Sussex wedding, the family grouping had changed. Forever. Legally. Publicly. In that moment, it wasn't paperwork anymore. It wasn't politics. It wasn't advisors. It wasn't optics. It was grief. The grief of losing a family structure. The grief of watching a son's life fracture. The grief of knowing that once the public saw the divorce, the monarchy would be blamed for something it didn't control. And that grief solidified something inside the king. Resolve. The kind of resolve that makes monarchs take actions history will judge decades later. He stood from his desk, walked to the window, looked over the frost-coated gardens of Windsor, and whispered something no one else heard. If it must be done, then let it be done now. He summoned his private secretary. It was time. But little did the king know. The envelope he'd just opened wasn't the most explosive one arriving that week. Because the real storm, the one that would shatter alliances, expose secrets, and redefine the Sussex narrative forever, was still on its way. And when it landed, nothing, absolutely nothing, would be the same. The king's private secretary moved quickly, almost too quickly for that early hour. The palace has its own rhythm, slow, ceremonial, deliberate, but on mornings like this, tradition bends to urgency. Within minutes, the highest-ranking advisors were assembled in the king's study, their faces tense, their voices lowered to near whispers. There's a certain look people get when handling crises. A stiffness in the shoulders, a sharpness in the eyes, a silence that fills the room before anyone speaks. That's what surrounded the king now. A circle of duty, fear, and calculation. "Your Majesty," one advisor said, choosing his words with precision, "if we do not act before the Sussexes file publicly, the monarchy will appear weakened." Another added, "Once the filing becomes known, the public will ask why the title remains in use. We cannot allow the dissolution of that marriage to carry a royal name this institution cannot defend." A third advisor, calmer but firmer, placed a hand on a stack of documents. "With respect, sir, the choice is between difficult and catastrophic." Catastrophic. That was the word that hung in the air like smoke. But Charles wasn't listening to their voices anymore. He was listening to another voice echoing in the back of his mind, one he hadn't heard in years. His mother's. Elizabeth II never spoke harshly, but she knew the cost of indecision. She knew how fast the monarchy could lose public confidence. She knew the weight of a title, how giving one could unite a nation, and how losing one could fracture it. Charles heard her calm instruction, one she told him many times. Act before you are forced to react. And in that moment, he understood. This wasn't just a legal matter. This wasn't a family disagreement. This was a moment history would scrutinize, dissect, and reference for generations. But before he could respond, before he could even process the advice swirling around him, the door opened again. A palace assistant hurried in, cheeks flushed from the cold, holding yet another envelope. Another one? So soon? Something was happening behind the scenes that no one had prepared for. The assistant bowed and handed the envelope to the king's secretary, who read the label, stiffened immediately, and passed it to Charles with more urgency than before. This one, Your Majesty, came directly from the Cabinet Office. The Cabinet Office? That meant government involvement. That meant political pressure. That meant the situation was far more explosive than anyone realized. Charles sliced the envelope open with the gold letter opener he'd inherited from his grandfather. Inside was a brief, stark message. A foreign government had contacted the UK with questions regarding the Sussex title and its relevance in upcoming diplomatic contexts. Not gossip, not tabloid noise. Diplomatic contexts. International relations. That was the tipping point. Because no matter what family drama unfolded behind the scenes, no matter what emotional fractures had occurred, no matter what misunderstandings existed between father and son, the monarchy could not become entangled in international affairs triggered by a marriage that had legally ended. That changed everything. Charles read the letter twice. Then a third time. His hand tightened around the page. Every advisor in the room waited, breath held, knowing that once the king spoke, the course of action would be sealed. Finally, Charles lowered the document. "It must be done today," he said quietly. No hesitation. No wavering. The king was no longer caught between roles. He had chosen his crown over his heart. But as he said those words, something shifted. Not in the room, in the king himself. Because acting as a monarch requires emotional distance. But Charles was not emotionally distant. He was not removed. He was not detached. He was a father. A father making a decision he never thought he'd face. A father who had once watched Harry beam with pride as the title was announced at the wedding reception. A father who remembered the joy, the hope, the promise, all now overshadowed by years of conflict. You could feel the weight crushing him, even as he maintained his composure. a silent heaviness that settled on every advisor present. But the decision was made. Now the palace machinery had to move, swiftly, precisely, ruthlessly. One advisor stepped forward. "Shall we open communication with the Sussex office before the announcement, sir?" Charles closed his eyes for a moment. A long moment, as if replaying every conversation he'd had with Harry since the beginning of the rift. "No," he said. "Not yet." Why? Why delay notifying them? Why wait? Because Charles knew something the advisors didn't. Harry wasn't ready. Not emotionally. Not mentally. Not strategically. He would react from pain, not logic. From impulse, not foresight. And reacting now, in the wrong way, would make the global headlines even worse. This announcement required timing, precision, sensitivity, and most importantly, a calm Harry. But Harry wasn't calm. Not in Montecito. Not in private. Not in the marriage that had quietly ended. How do we know? Because the envelope contained more than divorce confirmation. It contained a transcript. A summary of statements made by both parties during mediation. Private statements. Emotional statements. Contradictory statements. Statements that revealed just how deeply fractured the Sussex household had become. Statements that revealed Harry's fears, Harry's regrets, Harry's doubts. And those statements terrified the king in a way the public will never understand. Because tucked inside that transcript was one particular sentence from Harry that hit Charles like a hammer blow. A sentence advisors later described as deeply concerning, devastating, and a cry for help disguised as testimony. A sentence Charles would think about again and again in the hours leading to the public announcement. But that sentence, that emotional confession, that raw admission, will be revealed soon. But not yet. Because first, we must understand why the king paused, why he hesitated, even after deciding the revocation was necessary. It wasn't doubt. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't fear. It was the realization that this decision would end not just a title, but an era. The era of the new royal couple. The era of modern monarchy hopefulness. The era of the future king's younger son stepping into a redefined role. Ending the Sussex title meant ending the last vestige of an identity that had shaped global culture for nearly a decade. But endings in the royal family aren't quiet. They aren't clean. They aren't simple. They echo. They resonate. They reshape the future. And this one would do all three. The king stood, walked to the fireplace, and stared into the embers. His advisors waited. Finally, he spoke. "Prepare the official release. It will go out today." And with that, the machinery roared to life. PR teams drafted statements. Legal teams prepared confirmations. Communications began coordinating timing with global media outlets. Senior royals were informed one by one. But the one person who had not yet been told, Harry. And that wasn't a mistake. It was the calm before the most painful phone call Charles would ever make. The call that would break a son. The call that would define a king. The call that would set into motion the next act of this royal saga. And what came next? No one, not even the king, was prepared for. Before the king could make that painful call, before the world could wake up to a morning that would shift royal history, another development unfolded. One that made everything far more complicated. A senior communications officer rushed into the room, tablet in hand, eyes wide with that unmistakable mixture of urgency and dread. "Your Majesty," she said, breathless, "we have a problem." Of course they did. The royal family never faces one crisis at a time. But this one made every advisor straighten with alertness. "Something leaked," she continued. "Not the divorce itself, but something related to the Sussex household." "A leak? Already? How?" Charles inhaled sharply, bracing himself. "What kind of leak?" he asked. The advisor hesitated. "Audio, sir." Audio. That one word was enough to send a ripple of panic through the room. Audio meant conversation. Conversation meant context. And context means vulnerability. The worst kind. She tapped the screen. A transcript appeared, a partial one. The type acquired quickly, sloppily, by someone who didn't understand the importance of accuracy when dealing with royal communications. And the most alarming part? It wasn't new. It wasn't fresh. It was from weeks earlier. That meant someone had been sitting on it. Waiting. Watching. Biding their time. Someone who chose today, the very morning the divorce confirmation arrived, to drop it into the bloodstream of the press. Strategically, maliciously, or worse, as revenge. But what exactly had leaked? The transcript contained fragments of a heated discussion involving Meghan, a legal consultant, and someone identified only as H. The tone was tense, sharp, cold, and one line stood out above all others. A line so cutting, so revealing, that the communications officer had highlighted it. It read, "This title does nothing but trap us in expectations we can't meet." Trap. Expectations. Can't meet. Those words were devastating for the palace. Not because of their meaning, but because of how they would be interpreted. The monarchy thrives on symbolism, on tradition, on duty. So when a member of the royal family describes their title, a gift of honor, as a trap, the public sees it as an insult. The media sees it as disrespect. The monarchy sees it as a threat. But Charles saw something else. Something painful. Something utterly heartbreaking. He saw Harry's voice underneath Meghan's words. Because it wasn't Meghan who said the line. It was Harry. And that is what stopped the king cold. His son. The boy he raised. The boy who once embraced royal titles as symbols of purpose. Now calling his own identity a trap. Charles whispered the line aloud, almost as if saying it made it real. "This title does nothing but trap us." Advisors exchanged glances. For the monarchy, this was a headline waiting to explode. But for Charles, this was a father realizing just how deeply his son had been struggling. Everything made sense now. The silence, the distancing, the emotional contradictions in the divorce testimony. Harry felt trapped, not just in the marriage, not just in the media pressure, but in the very title Charles had hoped would protect him. And that was the moment something shattered inside the king. He wasn't just dealing with a divorce. He wasn't just dealing with palace optics. He wasn't just dealing with diplomatic consequences. He was dealing with a son who saw a royal identity as a burden. And in that moment, that heartbreaking, devastating moment, Charles understood why revoking the Sussex title wasn't just necessary. It was merciful. Removing the title wasn't punishment. It was release. The release Harry couldn't ask for. The release he didn't know how to pursue. The release he didn't have the emotional clarity to request. But the release he needed. And now, the leak forced his hand. Because once this audio reached the press, and it would, the monarchy would be accused of handing titles to individuals who rejected their meaning. That's when Charles made the final call. He stepped forward, voice steady but eyes heavy. "This cannot wait. The title must be revoked today." And then, almost reluctantly, "And Harry must hear it from me." The room fell silent. Everyone knew what that meant. The call, the conversation, the inevitable heartbreak. But before the king could lift the phone, before he could dial Montecito, before he could brace for the emotional storm of that father-to-son moment, his private secretary entered the room once more. "Your Majesty, Harry is already on the line." Already? How? Why? Had he somehow sensed it? Had someone informed him? Was the leak reaching him in real time? The secretary continued. "He says it's urgent. He says he needs to speak with you immediately." Every advisor froze. This wasn't supposed to happen yet. Harry wasn't supposed to know anything about the divorce's arrival, about the upcoming announcement, about the letter of patent ready for signature. But here he was, on the phone, ready, and the timing was too perfect to be coincidence. Charles took a quiet breath, steeled himself, reached for the receiver. "Put him through," he said softly. The room emptied, leaving the king alone. Just a father, just a son, and then, "Dad." Harry's voice cracked through the receiver. Fragile, uneven, wounded, not angry, not confrontational. Something worse. Broken. And Charles knew instantly. Harry wasn't calling because he sensed the title was about to be revoked. He was calling because something else had happened. Something unexpected. Something that pushed him to pick up the phone at dawn. The king's heart tightened. "Harry," he said gently, "what's happened?" There was silence. A long, painful silence that made Charles grip the phone tighter. And then, barely above a whisper, "Dad, I think I made a mistake." A mistake. The word hung in the air like a ghost. What mistake? What had he done? What had gone wrong? Charles waited, trying not to sound panicked. "A mistake in what way?" he asked. Another silence. Then, Harry's voice trembled as he said, "I don't think I want this divorce." Every muscle in Charles's body went still. The divorce was finalized. The documents were sealed. The filings prepared. And now, Harry was unraveling. No advisor could have predicted this. No legal team could have prepared for it. The Sussex marriage wasn't just over. It was ending while Harry was emotionally collapsing. And the king, holding the phone, realized with horrifying clarity. He was about to revoke the Sussex title. On the same day his son confessed. He no longer wanted the marriage to end. That collision, that emotional contradiction, was catastrophic. And this was only the beginning. For a moment, King Charles couldn't speak. Not because he didn't have words, but because he suddenly had too many. A father wants to say, "Of course, son, we'll fix this." A king wants to say, "It's too late. The world is already turning." And a human being, caught somewhere between grief and responsibility, wants to say nothing at all. Harry's voice on the other end of the phone didn't sound like the confident man who once walked down the aisle of St. George's Chapel to cheers from both sides of the Atlantic. It sounded like the boy Charles remembered consoling after the press printed cruel headlines about Diana. It sounded like the young man who once told him, "I don't want to be a burden." It sounded like someone who'd been fighting battles no one else could see. "Dad, did you hear me?" Harry asked. Charles swallowed. "I heard you." Another thick pause, breathing on both ends of the line. Emotion, heavy and unspoken, filling the space. "Harry," Charles said softly, "what has changed?" Harry exhaled shakily, and Charles could almost picture him, rubbing his face, pacing a room, eyes swollen with exhaustion. "I don't know," Harry whispered. I don't think this is what I wanted." Not really. What he wanted. But that was the tragedy, wasn't it? For years, nobody, not the palace, not the public, not the press, really knew what Harry wanted. Not fully, not completely, not beneath the layers of anger, passion, rebellion, love, loyalty, resentment, pressure, and fear. "Your mother," Charles began, then stopped himself. He rarely invoked Diana during emotional moments. It felt like touching a wound still too raw. But Harry filled the silence for him. "She wouldn't have wanted this," he said. "She wanted us to be stronger than this. She wanted me to build a family. A family. The one he thought he'd found. The one he thought would shield him from the mistakes of the past. But a family built on pain cannot stand." And Harry, for the first time, was admitting it. "Dad, what if we can fix it?" he asked. Charles felt a tear burn in his eyes. Not because of the question, but because of the timing. The tragic, impossible timing. Because downstairs, at that very moment, the letter of patent revoking the Sussex title was being prepared for release. It was done, signed, sealed, imminent. And Harry, in his most vulnerable moment, had no idea. Charles closed his eyes. "Harry," he said gently, "divorce is not something that happens overnight. But the documents you both signed." "I know," Harry interrupted. "I know what I signed. I know what it looks like. I didn't think it would feel like this." Feel like this. A sentence that sliced straight through Charles's composure. Because Charles recognized that feeling, the shock of loss, the realization that the consequences of your decisions don't hit you until the ink is already dry. Harry continued, voice trembling. "I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought walking away would make everything better. But it's like the moment the papers were finished, everything collapsed inside me." Collapsed. Charles finally spoke with a father's honesty. "You are not alone, Harry. You have never been alone." "Yes, I am," Harry whispered. "Dad, you don't understand. It's not just the marriage. It's everything. I don't know who I am without her. I don't know who I am without the title. I don't know who I am without something." There it was. The confession Charles had feared. The vulnerability buried in the divorce transcript. The emotional fracture he hoped was exaggerated. But hearing it directly shattered any doubt. Harry didn't just feel uncertain. He felt unanchored. Identity is everything in the royal family. Identity is destiny. Identity is duty. But Harry, stripped of structure, torn between two worlds, stood in a void. A void Charles played a part in creating. A void Meghan played a part in shaping. A void the media deepened. A void fame exacerbated. And now, the title revocation, which was meant to shield him, would strike him like a blow. The king steadied his breath. Harry, he said, listen to me. Your worth, your identity, does not depend on a title. Harry's reply was immediate. Then why did you give me one? Charles froze. Because how do you answer that? How do you explain that he did it out of love, out of hope, out of tradition, out of duty, out of a desire to give his son a future? How do you explain that now he was revoking it out of the same reasons? He tried. I gave it to you because I believed in the life you were building. And I am revoking it because I must protect the life you still have ahead of you. Harry fell silent. Then, what does that mean? Charles's voice cracked. Just once, before he steadied it. It means things are changing. A decision has been made. A hinge in the universe clicked. The moment shifted. Harry sensed the truth before it was spoken. What decision? Harry asked sharply. Dad, what have you done? Charles felt the world close in around him. Harry, he said softly. Your title, the Sussex title. Harry inhaled sharply. Too sharply. No. No, Dad, don't. Is being revoked. Silence. Not an empty silence. A violent one. The kind of silence that feels like a scream stuck in the air, unable to escape. Charles shut his eyes. Harry, please understand. But the line cracked with emotion. Why didn't you tell me? Harry demanded, voice cracking with betrayal. Why did I have to hear it like this? Why now? Why did I? And Charles, a king who could face parliaments, prime ministers, global crises, suddenly had no answer that felt right. Because there was no right answer. Only the truth. Which he finally said. Because I had no choice. Harry whispered. You always have a choice. The line went dead silent again. The king's hand trembled. And at that exact moment, as one of the most devastating conversations in modern royal history unfolded, a palisade knocked on the door. Your Majesty, he said nervously. The press has begun asking questions. Something leaked. Charles felt the ground shift under him. Already? Too soon. Much too soon. What leaked? Charles asked. The aide swallowed. Sir, the media has obtained part of the divorce file. Charles's eyes widened. A rumor was manageable. A headline was survivable. But a leak from the sealed divorce file? That was catastrophic. Which part? Charles asked, dread twisting in his stomach. The aide held up a trembling tablet. The part about the custody disagreement. Custody. The word that would ignite the world. And just like that, in one horrifying instant, everything the king had tried to control was now spiraling out of it. Custody. The kind of word that doesn't just make headlines, it detonates them. The moment the aide said it, the king felt a coldness crawl through him, the kind that doesn't come from winter air, but from the unmistakable realization that things had officially spun beyond palace control. Harry, still on the line, heard the word too. Custody, he repeated, voice sharp, shredded. What do you mean custody? What leaked about custody? The aide, hearing Harry's voice through the receiver, froze. Charles covered the microphone with his hand. What precisely has been leaked? The king asked. The aide took a steadying breath. Sir, the media received excerpts suggesting that the children's living arrangements were a point of dispute in the final documentation. They're calling it a custody conflict. Charles felt the air evaporate between his ribs. Not that. Not the children. Anything but the children. Royal scandals involving adults are survivable. Royal scandals involving children are firestorms. The monarchy knows this. The media knows this. Every PR strategist from London to Los Angeles knows this. And Harry? Harry knows this better than anyone alive. Because he was that child once. A child caught in the middle of a war between parents. A child whose emotional life became tabloid currency. A child whose entire childhood was shaped by the words custody and public scrutiny. So when he heard that word, that loaded, devastating word, something snapped inside him. He didn't sound angry anymore. He sounded terrified. Dad? What exactly leaked? Harry asked again, almost whispering now. Tell me. Charles looked at the aide. The aide nodded shakily and handed him the tablet. Charles read the excerpt. He closed his eyes. This was worse than he imagined. The leak was brief, no more than a few lines, but devastating in implications. It stated, "Parties disagree on long-term residency and travel arrangements regarding minor children. A final determination has been deferred." Deferred. Disagree. Residency. These were not emotionally neutral words. These were words that implied far more than legal negotiation. These were words the media would twist into 1,000 untrue narratives before lunch. And they weren't even accurate. They were taken out of context, selectively, to ignite maximum outrage. Which meant, this wasn't an accident. This was targeted, deliberate, strategic. Someone wanted this leak. Someone wanted this timing. Someone wanted this chaos. Charles felt a sinking sensation in his chest. He lifted the phone again. "Harry," he began carefully. "What does it say?" Harry demanded. "Dad, tell me." Charles exhaled slowly. "It says there was a disagreement regarding the children's living arrangements." Harry's inhale was sharp, too sharp. "What? That's not true. That's not what happened. That's—" His words tangled, then broke. "No, no, Dad, you don't understand. This wasn't supposed to get out. None of that was supposed to be public." "I know," Charles said quietly. "Where did it come from?" Harry asked, panic rising. "Who leaked it? Who would do that?" But Charles already knew the real question Harry was afraid to ask. What will they say about me? About Meghan? About the kids? Because once the media begins weaving narratives around children, the tone shifts from scandal to condemnation. And Harry, more than anyone, knows how brutal that shift can be. His breathing quickened. "Dad, what do I do?" he asked, voice trembling in a way that made Charles's heart ache. Before Charles could answer, his private secretary stepped forward again. "Your Majesty," he said urgently, "there's more. Several American outlets are preparing to run articles within the hour. One is suggesting Meghan sought full legal custody." Harry heard it, and it detonated him. "What?" Harry practically choked. Full custody? No, that's not what happened. That's not what that's not." His voice cracked into something raw and unguarded. Charles stepped away from his advisors, lowering his voice into something gentler. "Harry, listen to me. Deep breath. Don't panic." But panic was already there. Because Harry wasn't reacting as a public figure. He was reacting as a father. As a man afraid of losing something he loved. As a son who never wanted his children to experience the same pain he had. "Dad, please," Harry whispered. "Tell me this isn't happening. Tell me you can stop it." Charles wished he could. He wished he could fix everything. Undo everything. Shield Harry from the world the way he never could protect Diana. But this time was different. He wasn't powerless. He was king. Yet even kings cannot stop leaks. Not once they hit the bloodstream of global media. And they had. An advisor whispered urgently. "Sir, TMZ just posted the headline. Another. So has Sky News. Another. Social media is erupting. And then, sir, CNN has issued a breaking news banner." It was too late. The story was out. And Harry felt it in real time. His breathing grew ragged. "Dad, I can't do this," he said. "Not the custody stories. Not the speculation. Not the kids being dragged into this. I can't live through that again." Charles felt something break inside him. "Harry," he said firmly, finally letting the father speak louder than the king. "You will not go through this alone. I won't allow it." But the damage was already spreading. And that wasn't all. Because one advisor, pale, shaking, hesitant, stepped forward again. "Your Majesty, there's another leak." Charles turned slowly. "What now?" The advisor swallowed hard. "A source is claiming that yesterday's mediation session ended in a confrontation between Harry and Meghan. A confrontation. A single word with the power to ignite global frenzy." Harry heard it too. "Dad," he whispered. Charles's voice was soft, heavy, bruised. "Harry, what happened yesterday?" Silence. Then, "Dad, you don't want to know." That silence said everything. And nothing. And too much. It confirmed what the king feared and what the world would soon begin to speculate. This was no simple divorce. No mutual decision. No amicable separation. This was something deeper. Something darker. Something emotionally shattering. Harry whispered again, voice breaking apart. "Dad, I didn't mean for any of this. I didn't want this to be public. I didn't want the kids involved. I didn't want." He stopped. And in that stop, there was confession, regret, pain, fear. Charles placed a hand over his eyes. "Harry," he said, "there is something else you must know." He could hear Harry tense. What? Charles exhaled, the kind of exhale that carries the weight of history. The title revocation, it's done. Another silence. Longer. Heavier. Unbroken. Then, Dad, I'm losing everything. Charles's voice cracked. No, son. You're not losing everything. But Harry answered with a truth that pierced the king deeper than any critic or crisis ever could. It feels like I already have. And that, right there, was the moment King Charles realized. This wasn't a political crisis. This wasn't a royal scandal. This wasn't a strategic decision. This was a tragedy, and it was only the beginning.